Okay. Um, all right, so we can get started. So tonight is all about shifting, derailleurs, the whole system that allows us to shift. So the gears, the front and rear gears, the chain, the cables and springs and derailleurs and shift levers are part of that too. So there are, so different bikes have different shifting systems. So I'm going to talk about sort of a more like one of the most standard. So there definitely are, old style 3-speed bikes that have the gears are inside of the rear hub. There are even newer ones that have the gears inside of the hub. I'm not going to be talking about that tonight. There are electronic shifters. I'm not going to be talking about those tonight, but those run on the same principles of the mechanical shifters that we'll be talking about. And so if what I show you looks a little bit different than what's on your bike, that's okay. There should be a translation of at least the concept, if not the very actual thing. It's funny, I was telling Dara, I've taught this class so many times, but this is the first time teaching it online and not in person. So usually a lot of the cues are kind of people's bikes and my bike and looking at things. So I'm looking at just like this little set of parts, trying to figure out where to start. So I think I'll just start with some anatomy before we get into the physiology. So I think I'll just start with naming some parts. So on your bike, depending on whether you have kind of a mountain bike style, hybrid style bike with flat bars, you might have thumb shifters or different kind of shifters. On a road bike that has the drop bars, you might have old style shifters would be probably on the down tube of the bicycle. But newer shifters are integrated into the shift and brake levers. Other types of shifters. There are a lot of different types of shifters, but the shifters are all really doing the same thing. The shifters are pulling on the cable. So they're really just a lever with a way for you to be able to push or pull that is going to then be pulling on cable. So that's not a shift cable. This is a shift cable. And the shift cable has a head on it that looks like that. And that actually is buried inside of the shifter and gets caught in part of the mechanism. And then depending on what you're pushing or pulling on, it'll pull on the shift cable. And the other end of the shift cable, depending on whether it's for your front set of gears, if you have a bike with a front derailleur with 2 or 3 chain rings in the front, and then a gear, so that would be looking, this is a set of chain rings. There's 3 on here, but sometimes a bike would have 1, 2, or 3 chain rings depending on the number of gears. And then in the back, on your rear wheel, there'd be a gear cluster that might have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or 11 gears on it, depending on how many speeds your bike has. And you can find out how many speeds your bike has just by multiplying the number of front chain rings by the number of rear gears, cogs on the gear. So the old-fashioned, the 10-speed bike had 2 chain rings in the front, 5 gears in the back, and then you multiply that, you get 10 different gear combinations. So where the cable will run from your shift lever, then it'll usually run through a piece of housing that would look maybe not this color, but it might look something like this. And then it would run along your bike, along the frame of your bike, to maybe another piece of housing or underneath the bike frame to get up to your front derailleur. And then that's usually on a bike if you are shifting with your left hand as you're riding the bike on your, that's usually to shift the chain rings in the front, and then on your right hand, usually it'll be shifting the rear gears in the back. So that cable would run from that shift lever all the way to the back of your bike, and there usually is a little piece of housing that then goes into the rear derailleur. So this is a front derailleur. So this is what, and they attach to the bike in different ways. So this one in particular attaches around the frame, the seat tube of the bike would go right here, and there's a clamp that clamps it on. So that would be attached, and then this would run on top of the chain rings. And what the derailleur does, it's a derailer. So the chain is running through, this derailleur has 2 different plates. It has an outer plate and an inner plate. And what those plates do is, as the chain runs through it, this derailleur, when you're pulling on the cable, where's the cable come in on this one? So it's kind of awkward, but this is a clamp with a nut and a bolt. And if I were to loosen this is where the cable would be, depending on the configuration of your front derailleur. Some go down under the frame and up through the front derailleur, and some come down from the top and come down. But either way, when you pull on the cable, this one would have to be a top down, because when I'm pulling where the cable is pinched here, if I were to pull on that, I can't, my hand isn't strong enough, but the leverage that I would have with a shift lever would be strong enough to pull the cable this way. And what I'm doing when I'm pulling the cable up and down is it's moving this derailleur side to side. So the derailleur is a really nice translator of up and down motion from the cable, because the cable can't come in from the side because you'd bump into it with your body. So the cable has to run along the bike frame and come either up from the bottom or down from the top. And when it does that, it's pulling up and down. And the front derailleur, as the rear derailleur does too, but we'll look at it in the front first, has what's called a parallelogram design. So if you imagine, like this, and then also 2 more parallel lines. And so the parallelogram on this derailleur is, it's a little bit hard to see. Let me see if I can get it. Yeah, the parallelogram on this derailleur is, there's a pivot here, a pivot here, a pivot here, and a pivot here. So if you think of those 4 corners pivoting, so it's translating up and down motion of the cable to a side-to-side motion of the cage, which are these 2 plates. And all the derailleur does is, when you're pulling on the cable and you're trying to move into a larger chain ring in the front, which is a harder gear in the front, it's going to, this inner plate is going to push, sorry, my hand gets in the way because well, I have to do it this way. So the inner plate is going to push the chain. It's going to go and push the chain up into the second gear, into the second chain ring or the third bigger chain ring, depending on how far you're pulling the cable. So you might go this way if you shift into the middle gear, and then it might go that much to shift into the biggest chain ring. And then and then this is something that I cover in great detail in the brakes class. Welcome. Is that a cable is really good at, it's like a rope. So a cable is a twisted strands of metal wires that are all twisted together. And what a cable is really good at is pulling. So if you take the slack out of the cable and then you have two ends fixed. If I pull on one end, it's going to pull the other end. So one end of this would be my shift lever, and the other end would be fixed in the derailleur. And if I pull, I'm going to be pulling, but if I push on the cable, it does not push the other end away. So pushing on a rope does not do anything. And when I was giving this talk, this class once, my ex-husband he was in mechanical engineering. He's like, it took us a whole semester to say that. You can't push on a rope. It's like, all right, you just got it from me tonight. So, so a cable can pull, and that's what it does to make the derailleur move. But then when you're shifting in the other direction with your shift lever, and you're pushing and you're letting the cable go back, taking the slack, like doing the opposite of pulling, you can't push on it. So what happens is there's a spring right here. This is a spring that gets, let me see what it actually does. It either coils more or uncoils. I have to look at it for a second to actually see what it's doing. I am coiling this, I'm coiling that spring up more as I pull the derailleur out. It's causing the spring, which is right in here, to coil. And then when I let go, that's what's snapping back. The spring is snapping back. So cable is pulling, you're pulling on the cable to make the derailleur move in one direction. And then as you let the shift lever go back in the other direction, the spring is recoiling or uncoiling, whichever way you want to say it, the derailleur back in to shift in the other direction. So the derailleur is really just a pushing, it's a device that's taking up and down motion, moving it to side and side motion. It has a bunch of pivot points. And then it has these two plates. The two plates are actually, they have to be attached because they're being moved by this mechanism, but they're acting independently. This plate is going to be pushing the chain in one direction, and this plate is going to be pushing the chain in the other direction when you're coming back down. And that is the workings of the front derailleur. The front derailleur also will have a couple of screws that are very enticing. And this is the head of a screw here, and this is the head of a screw here. And if I put it like this, you can kind of see. This is a screw. These are threads of a screw. That screw comes down and all the way through. The bottom of the screw is this screw. The bottom of that screw is right here. The bottom of this screw comes down to here. What those screws do, those are called limit screws. And the screws help define how far I can move in one direction or the other. What the screws are doing, they're very much like door stops. So if you can imagine a door and you have a door stop, you open the door, and once it hits the door stop, you can't open it anymore. And if you were to take that door stop and either make it shorter or move it into the wall, you could open the door a little bit further. If you were to make that door stop a lot longer, you wouldn't be able to open the door as much. It would hit the door stop sooner. The ends of the screws actually hit little pieces of metal that have just been made for this purpose. They're a piece of the derailleur that hit the end of the screw when I move it all the way out as far as it can, it's hitting one of the screws. And when I let it out all the way, there's a metal plate that's hitting the other end of the screw. So if I were to dial screw, one of the, so there's a high limit screw and a low limit screw. One is saying how far the derailleur can go this way, and the other one's saying how far the derailleur can go this way. So it's determining how far your derailleur can push your chain up to the biggest chain ring and potentially over and off of it, or down to the lowest chain ring in the front, and potentially, if these aren't adjusted correctly, you could go down and slip off and inside. And I'll circle back to that in a minute about the chain slipping off into the inside. This is rarely the cause of issues because these usually the limit screws usually get set up by a mechanic when they're first installing the derailleur. And the reason the limit screws exist is because there are different sets of chain rings that have slightly different spacing, that the same derailleur, like this derailleur might be on 8 different models of bicycles that have slightly different chain rings. And one of chain rings are the front gears. So this has 3 chain rings. And this is, if a chain ring off of, like, that's a chain ring right there, front set of gears. Sometimes they come all together and sometimes they come in pieces that you can assemble together. So this set of chain rings, when I'm adjusting the bike for the first time, when this derailleur is being put on and adjusted for height and for how far, it's called the throw of the derailleur, how far it's going to move in one direction to the other, like the end of its movement in one direction to the end of its movement in the other direction is called the throw. And to accommodate various different sets of chain rings. Sometimes if you just have one or two, you wouldn't need a derailleur if you just have one chain ring because the chain would just always stay on that chain ring. But if you have 2 chain rings versus 3 chain rings, you need the derailleur to be able to move a different amount. Like if you only had 2 chain rings, you wouldn't want the derailleur to be able to go up to a imaginary 3rd chain ring. So the limit screws on the derailleur would be adjusted by a mechanic when they're setting the bike up for the first assembling the bike. Once that's set up, these screws are manufactured to not slip. So a lot of screws on bicycles, a lot of nuts and bolts, because of all the vibration of riding over roads, a lot of times nuts and bolts will work themselves loose just by vibration. So racks, fenders, pedals, water bottle cages, other accessories, bells and whistles. Those things tend to, from time to time, you want to check and make sure that they're tight because those will tend to rattle loose. These screws are made to not rattle loose in general. I'm not going to say there's always an exception to the rule. So if these were not presenting a problem in the first, like if these have not been presenting a problem from the day that you got your bicycle, they're probably not going to be the solution to the problem that you're having. They tend to be the first, they're just like, you go to a derailleur, you have a screwdriver, and what can you do? You could, if you wanted to, you can take a screwdriver and play with the limit screws. What you'll probably do if you do that is make it so that you're either, your derailleur either is going too far in one direction or not far enough in one direction and you can't access your gears. But if that's a problem that manifests or presents itself well into you owning or using your bicycle, the chances are it's either we can talk about, it's either maybe a cable tension problem. So if the cable isn't tight enough, you won't be able to get up into your hardest gears in the front. If the cable is too loose, you might not be able to get into the lower gears in the front. This is the cable that's going to the front derailleur. If your gears are worn out, or if your derailleur, if the spring is worn out on the derailleur, which happens over a long period of time, but it can happen, it might not be able to bring your back into your easier gears. if you are having a problem consistently, if you're going up into your harder gears and your chain gets thrown, and that happens more than just a one-off way fluky thing, if that's happening, that would be a sign that it's a limit screw problem. And so what you would want to do is on each derailleur, they might be in a different spot because they've really just been manufactured to do this job. And so the metal plate that they hit could be kind of put anywhere. But on this bike, I can see on this derailleur, I can actually see from where I am, and I don't know if I can get the angle of this. Yeah, I think there, maybe. So watch. So what I want you to try to see is the bottom of this screw well, first of all, the bottom of this screw is hitting. So this derailleur is in the position because there's no cable tension on it at all. It's in like the most relaxed position. The spring has sprung it back. So this would be in the easiest gear. And the bottom of this screw is hitting a metal plate. And then when I go to pull on the cable and shift, I don't know if you can see. What I want you to try to see, there, maybe that angle. What I want you to is that, let's see if I can do it. It's really hard. Is that all of a sudden now the other screw is hitting. It's really hard to see, not in person. I apologize. So that story about the chain fell off, and I'm assuming off of the inside easy gear in the front, potentially. It's more common for it to fall off that way than over the harder gear. But sometimes that can happen because your chain is under tension. I'm going to pause this. I'll return to that. I'll return to why the chain might fall off the easier gear when we get to the rear derailleur, because the rear derailleur plays a big role in that. Before we move on, questions about the front derailleur before we move on? Anne-Marie?
Yeah, my question is, when you say that it hits the screw,
Yeah.
do you mean that the thing hits the bottom of the screw?
Correct.
Okay, got it. Then
It hits
I saw what you were trying to point out. Thank you.
It hits the bottom of the screw, hits a piece of the derailleur, and it makes
basically the thing goes like this.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So the screw's coming down, and it goes clunk, clunk, and it can't. But if you were to dial that screw out, then it could go further. So there's these limit screws. The way that one would adjust them, although I caution you not to, is there's usually a marking, but not always. On this one, I don't think I can show it to you, but it's just a little raised letter in the same color. It's not no contrast. So there's an H here and an L there. But so the high is meaning the L is for low and the H is for high, and that has to do with the high gears or harder gears in the front are the bigger ones. The low gears are the smaller chain rings in the front. I could also just puzzle it out by looking at what's hitting when. But if you were to unscrew either of them, it would make it so that it could go further. So if I unscrew the high screw, then it would mean that as I pull the cable and push the derailleur out further and further, it could go further and further. And if I did that too much, and a little bit goes a long way, if I unscrewed that an extra half a turn, let's say, you would have then consistently every time you shoved your shift lever and tried to shift into your harder gears, it would kick the chain up and over and past the gears, and it would not be fun. And alternatively, if you tightened it too much, you just wouldn't be able to get into the highest gear in the front. The derailleur just wouldn't travel far enough for the inner plate to push the chain far enough. Conversely, for the lower gear, if I dialed it out too much, then the derailleur, the outer plate of the derailleur would move too much this way and push the chain off the small gears into like toward my bike frame, and that would be frustrating. And if it was too tight, then I wouldn't be able to shift into my small gear. So I'm not saying it can't ever be the problem, but it's not likely the problem unless it's sort of always been the problem. Any other questions about front derailleur? Okay, great. Doesn't mean you can't have more in the future. Just means for now we're gonna move on. So then the front derailleur, the chain is on the front chain rings. The chain is also going around the rear set of cogs. This is one example of there's a couple different words for this. This can either be called a cog set, like a set of cogs, or a cassette, which are interchangeable at this point for bicycles. And this slips onto the rear hub and is the rear cluster of gears. One thing to point out about the rear cluster of gears is that it's a little bit opposite and slightly counterintuitive unless you kind of go deep and heavy into gear ratios, but I'm just going to sort of give it to you to memorize, and then we can talk about it more later if we have time. So on the front set of gears and your chain rings, you're going to have to pedal. It's going to feel harder when you're in the big chain ring and easier as you get to smaller chain rings. So high is harder gears, and then smaller as they get easier. The rear is reversed because of the way that ratios work. So, because it's a fraction. So you've got your harder gears in the back are the smaller ones. And let me see if I can do this justice of like a, I'll see if this makes any sense. But so the rear set of gears, as they turn, the rear wheel turns. So that's translating into the work of the driving of the bicycle, because our bicycles are rear wheel drive. The front wheel just is along for the ride. So you're driving the bicycle by spinning the rear gears. You're spinning the rear wheel. So that takes effort. On the front, in the chain rings, as you're pedaling around, as you pedal around the big chain ring, for example, you're going to get a certain length of chain to go around, which is a big length of chain. So you're doing like a fair amount of work to pull that chain around. And then if you were in the smallest gear here, with that large amount of chain that you're pulling, you're going to probably spin this 3 or 4 times, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 times. And that's making your rear wheel spin 2 or 3 or 4 times. That's a lot of work. You're going a pretty good distance. If you were to chalk out your rear wheel 3 or 4 times out, that's a lot. If you have if you're in a hard gear in the front and then you're in an easier gear in the rear, this might only spin 1.5 to 2 times, meaning your rear wheel's only spinning 1.5 to 2 times. It's much easier. It's going to feel easier. And so you just have to, but you have to, because the ratio is different. So if that didn't catch, that's fine. You can always go back and review that on your own if you want to, and you don't have to. It's not all that important. All that I'm trying to get across is the easier gears are the large ones in the back that are up high, and the small gears that are down lower are the harder gears in the rear, which isn't maybe intuitively obvious. Rear gears. So the rear derailleur is similar in its function to the front derailleur. It also is pushing the chain it's just going to push the chain and make it go from make it go from one gear to the next and push it back in the other direction to shift through the rear gears. It looks a little bit different, and this one actually looks, there's actually quite a bit of tension on the chain when it's all assembled. So the way that this rear derailleur would look when it's on the bike, and there's a spring there that I'm pushing against, is like this. As soon as I let go, that's gonna spring back. But there's a fair amount of tension on the chain, so that would hold that in place. This rear derailleur, not all rear derailleurs come with this piece. Sometimes they just bolt into the bicycle onto a piece that looks kind of like this, that's already a part of the bike frame. This happens to go attach inside of where the wheel attaches. So this piece is not always there. Sometimes there's a piece on the bicycle that looks very much like this that then the derailleur attaches to. If it's a piece of the bicycle, or even maybe here, this is called the Derailleur Hanger in the rear. It's pretty slim. It's like a flat piece of stamped metal. And it has a big pivot point here where it does this. And there's a spring curled up and wound up inside of here. So this piece is actually quite delicate. And this is the reason, one of the reasons why somebody may or may not have told you in the past not to lay your bike down on the side with the derailleur, because if you do, there's a lot of, there'll be force from the ground going like this, and you can actually bend the area of the derailleur hanger, and that can really throw off all of the shifting from once it's bent. That can really bungle up shifting. So if you're going to lay your bike down, which is not a problem at all, just try to do it on so the two sides of the bicycle, there's a left side and a right side, but it depends, like if you're facing the bicycle or riding the bicycle, those would invert. So there's a way of talking about the bicycle that if you're riding the bike on the right hand side where all the gears are, so the chain ring, the chain, and the gears in the back, that's called the drive side of the bicycle. And then by default, the other side, which is when you're riding the bicycle on your left side, is the non-drive side. So on the drive side of the bicycle, if you're going to lay your bike down, lay it down on the non-drive side to protect the derailleur. So the rear derailleur does two things. One is it does the shifting of the gears. And so the way that it does that is similarly. So the cable is going to be coming in to the rear derailleur right here. And it'll usually be like coming from the front of the bike there. And then there might be a piece of housing that's about that long coming to your bike frame, and then it would continue on as cable. So the cable would be coming through this piece of housing and come right through here and come right through here and then get pinched, and there is a clamp here, a nut and a bolt or just a bolt, actually, a bolt with a washer, and the cable just goes through and gets clamped there and held steady. So that's the functional end of the cable. And so when you pull on the cable, what it does is translate. So the motion that you're pulling now is, you imagine your bike frame's like right here. You're pulling in the kind of like forward backward motion. And what that's doing, forward backward motion would be this way now. And what that's doing with this piece is the parallelogram. And there's a pivot point here, 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 and here. The silver bits are the four corners. And as it pivots, you can see the parallelogram shifting. That's translating this back and forth motion of the cable yanking to this side-to-side motion. This piece is actually fixed in the bike frame, so it's not, this isn't, your bike frame isn't going like that. This is fixed. It's just hard for me with my arms. This is fixed, and this piece is moving. This piece being the piece that the chain is going through. So the chain is going to be running through here, and it's going to be moving up and down the gear cluster that way. So it's moving, when you click, 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 you go up into the easier gears if nobody has reversed your derailleur on you. There are some derailleurs that go in the opposite direction, and then, but it would be very strange to put a derailleur onto somebody's bike that goes in the opposite direction and not warn them beforehand or ask if they wanted that to be switched. So I was a little bit shocked and surprised. I know that that exists. So all that, it just means that things are a little bit reversed in the mechanism. And so instead of going this way, it would be going this way. But anyway, for most of us, most of the time, we're going to be pulling on cable, and it's going to be going up into the easier gears. And in the front, it's, if when we pull on cable, it's going to be going up into the harder gears for the front ones. The rear derailleur has that main function is, shifting through the rear cog set. The second main function is maintaining chain tension. And the reason why this, and so there are a set, so I skipped over what I talked about on the front derailleur is that when you pull on the cable, it pushes the derailleur in one direction by yanking it. And then when you let go, when you push the cable in the other direction, that pushing isn't going to do any action, but there is a spring in here running the length of that parallelogram from one corner, kitty corner, to the next. And so it gets, that spring gets stretched out. And then when you let go of the, push the shift lever in the other direction, you're allowing that spring to spring back. So you're like, with the spring. So that's the spring that opposes the cable action and brings your derailleur back in the other direction. There's another spring, this one that I have already showed you, that sort of cocks the derailleur and sets it in the right position. And then there's a third spring right here. And sometimes these springs are not as visibly obvious. Sometimes they're in plastic housing and you don't actually see them, but they're in here, coiled up. And that spring is allowing for this motion. And if this is your homework to do after this class or tomorrow or whenever you're with your bike next, if you have either your bike upside down or the rear wheel lifted, or somebody else is riding a bike in front of you, what you can watch as somebody shifts through their rear gears. So you could either do that if you have a bike stand and you have a way of pedaling through and shifting and watching it. But if you don't, if you can watch someone with a shifting, what you'll see is not just the derailleur going like this as you shift in and out, but you'll also see it going like this as it shifts, and then coming back as you shift through. And the reason why it's doing this is because if you imagine you have three pretty different, at least on this chain ring, set of chain rings, this circumference, so I mean the chain doesn't go around the whole circumference, but the half that it's going around, this is much smaller than this. And then likewise on the rear set of gears, when it's running around, the chain is running around here, it's much smaller than the distance here. So when you're in your smallest chain ring in the front and one of your harder gears, smaller cogs in the back, you would need a much shorter chain to go around that distance of small cog, small chain ring. And then in order to accommodate the larger cog in the back and the large chain ring, you'd need a much longer chain. But you can't change the length of your chain while you're riding. That would be a super fun magic trick. You cannot. And so how can your bike accommodate that is by this spring action. So you imagine this is a long chain, this is a shorter chain, or maybe it's the other, like this is taking up the slack of the chain. So as you need more chain, it's doing this. As you need less chain, this is cocking itself back. And the chain is running through here. The chain is running through here in the back. So that's something fun to watch as somebody's shifting. You can actually watch the rear derailleur not just shift in and out and up and down the cog set, but you can actually watch it go into action and make a chain go from long to short. And so this takes, so if this didn't do this and pull, so as the chain gets as there's extra chain that you're not using when you're in your smaller cog or smaller chain ring, this pulls back and pulls the slack out of the chain. And if that didn't happen, your chain would just be flopping off of the gears all of the time. So this brings me to the piece of sometimes when we go over a big bump, what happens is this happens like very instantaneously and momentarily. And we might not even, we probably won't see it happen because it's happening down and behind us. But this happens. And when this happens, it makes your chain much longer for an instant than it needs to be. So you go over a big bump and this happens and your chain flops off the inside. Usually it flops off the gear in the front that it's on. It usually flops towards the inside of the bike. And so your chain will come off and all of a sudden you have nothing to pedal against, and all of a sudden, and that's your balance, and could lead to, it either leads to you just going like this and then stopping and going, what the heck happened? Or it can lead to a mishap. So if that happens, sometimes people come to the conclusion that they need to tinker with their limit screws because their chain flops off. If your chain flops off most of the time that you shift into your smallest chain ring, it very well may be a limit screw problem. But if your chain flops off, if you go over railroad tracks or a curb, it just means that a big bump happened and your chain couldn't accommodate that momentarily, and it was too long and it came off of the gear, and you just have to get off the bike and be lucky that it's just, I think is an unfortunate set of, and there may have been other, I'm not saying that is that was the cause or that is the only way that could have happened, but that would be my if I had to give my best guess as to how a chain would flop off without any cause. There is a cause, it just isn't, there's nothing wrong with the bike necessarily in order for that to happen. Questions about the rear derailleur? Okay. So this class is one of a series of classes that I have taught over the course of the academic year. And so I would encourage you, we have another half hour to go today, but so during the brakes class, we talk a lot about barrel adjusters, and what those are little tools that are actually built into the bike of places where you can adjust cable tension on your brakes, and you can make your brake, you can pull your brake cable tighter or looser to bring the brake shoes in closer to the rim, or let them out a little bit more so that you either have less to pull on your brake levers or more to pull on your brake levers. So I'm not going to totally go into that in detail. If you want to learn about barrel adjusters, I encourage you to come to one of my brake classes, because that's when we have the time to do that topic justice. So right now I'm going to mention it, and it might, if you weren't at at the brake class yet, and you can either look up on YouTube. You can send me an email with a question. You can look up on YouTube. You can follow this up with your own curiosity. But as far as adjusting cable tension on the gear, on shifting, so over time, sometimes what'll happen is it's most common with the rear set of gears, but not impossible for the front set of gears, is that over time, you might have to adjust the cable tension either to make it a little bit tighter or a little bit looser. A little bit tighter, sometimes the cable, the strands of the cable sort of unwind over time, and you end up needing to tighten the cable up a little bit to accommodate for that. Sometimes the springs, they wear over time and tend to, the springs tend to not be as snappy over time. They lose a little bit of their tension. And so sometimes if your cable is tight, then the spring isn't as strong anymore and can't bring the derailleur back in the other direction. And sometimes you have to accommodate for that by letting a little bit of tension off of your brake cable. So to determine whether you think you have I think I said brake cable, but I meant derailleur cable, shift cable. So to determine whether your cable is too tight or too loose, so and I'll just use it would go the same would be for well, I'll just talk about the rear for now. So in the rear, if you are consistently having issues, so getting up into your easier gears, if you are consistently having issues getting up into your easier gears, so you're pulling on your chain, on your shift lever, whichever way you do that on your bike, and it's and it doesn't want to go up into the easier gears. Like maybe sometimes you have to pull what you'd think would be, you have to do 2 clicks and it just goes 1 gear. If you're having a hard time getting up into the easier gears, that would be an indication that you might need to tighten your shift cable a little bit. There are usually barrel adjusters where the cable housing, and this might not be exactly what your rear derailleur looks like, but where the cable housing meets the rear derailleur, there's usually the head of a bolt that you can spin. If you spin the bolt in what is typically thought of as the loosening direction, which it is for the bolt, if you spin the bolt in the lefty-loosey counterclockwise loosening direction for the bolt, what you're going to be doing is creating more space that the cable has to travel, and it's going to tighten the cable. Conversely, if you dial the barrel adjuster in the clockwise tightening the bolt direction, you're going to be creating slack in the cable and making the cable a little bit looser. If you are consistently having issues in the other direction where it's very snappy, it goes chint, 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 chint right up as you're biking, if you're not on a hill and you're biking and you're trying to get into your easier gears and it's consistently doing well, chint, 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 but you're having a hard time coming back down into your harder gears in the rear, it's delaying or you're having to click twice to make it go into one gear, that could be an indication that you need to loosen your cable a little bit. If you are having a problem shifting into your easier gears and you are having a problem shifting into your harder gears, it is not a cable tension problem because a cable cannot be too loose and too tight at the same time. You might have a cable tension problem, but that will not fix both. Because if you tighten your cable, you're going to get better shifting up into your easy gears, but it's going to make it worse, the performance shifting into your harder gears and vice versa. So if you're having problem in both directions, that's probably an indication that the gear, the chain, and this is something that is covered in the class that I just did last month, which was annual maintenance and chain chain lubrication and cleaning, and we talk about chain replacement. So as the chain wears, it wears out the gears in the back first and then the front. As everything wears out, and the derailleur maybe is also wearing at the same time over time, then if you're having trouble in both directions, it's time to go to the shop and have them try to diagnose what's going on and see what needs to be either adjusted, replaced. Other things that can contribute to shifting performance being compromised is along the run of the cable from the lever. So something could be happening inside the lever, from the lever through the housing, along your bike, and through the other piece of housing. Where the cable is inside of the housing, if there's any friction in there, so if any water or debris, dirt got into the housing because of inclement weather and various things, that is something that could also cause less than optimal shifting. The shifting system tends to be a lot more finicky than the brake system. The brake system is burly. It's meant to, it's a very, it's really strong because the point of it is to, you have to pull really hard on the cable to make sure that your wheel really stops. The shifting system isn't meant, isn't like that. It's a lot more of a kind of a fine tune pull. You pull a certain amount, a click, and then it moves the derailleur a certain amount to get you in the right gear. And you can imagine just a little bit of something being off can compromise shifting performance in a more fine-tuned way. Than brakes are just more of like a, they work or they don't, sort of. We go into more detail in the brakes class than that. Yeah, Anne Marie.
Yeah, could you repeat, please? I couldn't write quite quickly.
That's okay. Yeah.
That if you loosen the adjuster,
Yeah.
Does it make the cable
Tighter?
Tighter. Okay.
Yeah. So as you dial the barrel, and I go really into detail in this in the brakes class.
Yeah, I remember that brakes.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
really clear and very helpful. I fixed
sure.
brakes for a
Yeah.
while because of that.
And it's easier to it's easier to describe it. It's easier to see it happening on the
And
brake,
so, of
in the
course,
brake
in this
lever.
case too, it would be just the opposite. If you tighten the adjuster, the cable will be looser.
Yeah, and so I try to say, like, instead, like, I did use the words tighten and loosen for the bolt, but what I tend when I teach, I'll say dial in or dial out. So
Right. Or
dial it out, you're
lefty
making it,
loosey or righty tighty. Okay.
when you dial it out, which is in the counterclockwise direction, it's going to make it tighter. When you dial it in, it's going to make it looser.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And that brings us to the handout part of this evening, which is shifting tips. I really like going through this because I wrote it a long time ago and I hardly remember what it says, but I'm going to read. Actually, is there anybody else who wants to read the first like 2 paragraphs of this, and then we could have each person read a paragraph?
India,
Anybody?
can I ask a quick question
Yeah,
before
do
we go
please.
into
Yeah.
the handout? I'm so sorry. I have
That's
to
okay.
go a little bit early, but
Of
I
course.
want to
Yeah.
get my question in before
Yeah.
you go through
Yes.
the handout. So on my mountain bike, I have my shifters are like barrel shifters on my handlebars. So like as I'm riding, I just
Grip
rotate my
shift.
hands to shift. It's like a
Yes.
barrel shifter.
Yes. Yep.
And there is a little Allen wrench hole underneath my handlebars that is some sort of fine tuning. Does that work like a barrel adjuster, like a cable
Maybe.
adjuster?
I would
What does that adjust exactly? Do you know?
I'm trying to picture it in my note. So you're talking about like
Yes.
one of the brands is grip shift.
Yep.
So instead of having a lever, you actually are, so what's happening in there, and I'll try to, so what's happening in there is instead of in the shift lever, so like in the derailleur, the head of the cable, the head of the cable is caught in the shift lever, and then the other end of the cable, which just looks like, doesn't look like that, doesn't have a head, is just is pinched in at the derailleur end. So in a shifter that you're pushing or pulling on, the cable's going to be doing like, you're going to be going like clunk 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 clunk. In a grip shift, what's happening is it's the cable's in there like this,
Oh, okay.
and so the pulling of the cable is actually, you're like, so imagine this is the other end of the cable, you're like pulling as you twist it, you're just pulling more cable through, and then you're letting it back out.
Okay.
It's almost like a fishing reel.
Sure.
So that's what's happening inside of the shifter. The little Allen key, I don't know the answer to that. I would have to look it up, because there's definitely an Allen key, like the way that it's attached is like the clamp onto the handlebars. That's like one Allen key. And then there is like teeny little Allen. I know what you're saying. I can like picture it in my head, the place where like teeny little Allen key goes in, but I'm not recollecting that that's actually an adjustment.
That's okay. If you don't know, I can just keep digging for that information. I don't want to derail your class.
No, it's okay. I
it's
will,
just relevant to me.
if I have time, I'll try to find the answer to that. If you find it before I do, let me just put I'm going to put for everybody, my chat is huge. I'm just putting my email in the chat.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Yeah. And that
we can
way,
touch base offline then.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that'd be great. Because I wish I knew the answer, and I don't know the answer offhand.
We'll figure it out together. Thank you.
Cool. Yes, there are many different ways of pulling on a cable. And the grip shift is a kind of a cool one, if your wrists are up for the task. Any other questions like about you and your bike before because we'll probably go till we'll probably talk about the handout for the next 15 minutes until class is up, is my guess. So any
I'm
other
good for now.
Okay,
Yeah,
anybody else have any burning questions? And don't think of tonight as the end. Tonight is the beginning.
I did have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Fairly uncommon for the spring in both the derailleurs or either of them to go bad.
It takes, the springs do go bad over time. I've had some of my bikes for upwards of 20 years and they haven't, and I've had a bike, but on one bike it did, in the rear derailleur. Partly it has to do with how you, and this is like really getting into the weeds a little bit, like I don't want to panic anybody or make them feel like they have to know this, but so the springs, like on the rear derailleur, the spring is, if you shift into your easier gears, your derailleur is going to go like this, and it's really pulling on that spring. So if you store your bike like that, you're actually asking the spring to do a lot of work over time if it's just sitting like that. Because if you imagine you have a spring, and if you were just like cranking on that spring all the time, after some amount of time, the spring is just going to not bounce back. So one rule of thumb, and the only person I know who has done this is like a friend of mine who was a national, bike racer and bike mechanic. And he was like, you should, you really need to store your bike with the springs so that so in the front, it would be like taking all the tension off of the spring so that so as you pull on the cable, you're also asking the spring to do work so that then it snaps back to go in the other direction. So you actually want to have it so that it would be so that your cable is loose in both directions too. It's not to protect the cable, it's to protect the springs. So in your front set of gears, you'd be in the smallest chain ring to store the bike, and in your rear set of gears, you'd be in the smallest cog, which is so in the front, it's the easiest gear, in the rear, it would be the hardest gear. And to diagnose whether the spring is bad, that would be something it would need to happen in the shop, because they'd have to really kind of like rule out the cable. They'd have to, it's basically when you're working as a mechanic on shifting issues, you're almost always doing it by deduction. So you're like, it's not this and it's not that and it's not that, it's got to be this. So I wouldn't be able to look at a spring and tell that it's worn out. I'd have to you'd have to know what the derailleur should do, be able to kind of maybe take all the tension, like the chain off, and like play with it and go like, oh yeah, it shouldn't be floppy like that. Or you might just have to puzzle through as the bike is not performing well. You might have to go like, well, it can't be that and it can't be that. Oh, I guess maybe it must be the spring. And then you delve in a little further and then go, oh yeah, that spring isn't snapping back the way it should.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
So really good question. It's uncommon, but not impossible for the spring to be the issue. So and this will get to one of them, one of the most, so this is tips on shifting it, but it's a cross between how to kind of get the best performance out of your bike and have it be the most comfortable ride and kind of the best ride for you, and also maintenance wise. So I'll go back to my original question. Does anybody want to read the first 2 paragraphs other than me? And if not, I will happily. Okay, I'll go ahead and do it. That's fine. So I'm reading from the handout that is linked in the chat, and it's called my shifting tips. So my first tip is shift often, and then why? For safety, for comfort, and for convenience, for performance. So to maintain control. So when you're in an appropriate gear, you're able to maintain better control of your body and your bike. If you need to start from a dead stop just before an uphill climb, you can shift your gears while standing in place in a few easy steps. So the first is you would initiate the shift. So in order to get in, so if you come barreling down a hill and you're in a pretty hard gear, and then you get to a stop sign, which is a very common thing in Wisconsin I noticed like most downhills, you're gonna have a stop sign. Then you go like, oh, and then you go to start up again and you're not in an easy enough gear to be able to just kind of comfortably ride off, and now you're kind of in a hard gear and you're off balance. And so what you can do is you can shift the derailleur, with the shift lever, you can make the motion that you would be, so you're pulling on the cable and telling the derailleur to move, and the derailleur moves, but then the chain doesn't do anything until it's in motion. And so then if you are on your bicycle or off of your bicycle, you're just going to like lift up the rear of the bike so that the wheel comes off. So you can do that while you're on your bike if you can. If not, you can just simply step off of your bicycle and lift the rear of the bike up so that the rear wheel's off the ground, and then you can pedal through. You can either do it with your foot if you're standing on the bike, or if you're not, you can do it with your hand, and that'll shift up into easier gears. And that way you can get into the gear that you want to be safe, to be crossing maybe a really busy street. For your bike, the more you use one particular gear, and so I said, in other words, the chain is tugging on one chain ring and one cog. So in your favorite gear, the gear that you're like 90% of the time I ride in this gear because it's just like the best gear combination for me. That's like wearing your favorite shoes. If you had 7 to 10 pairs of shoes and you liked one the best and you wore them every day, you would not be surprised that that was a pair of shoes that wore out. When you're riding your bike, if you stay in one gear, that gear is going to wear out to the exclusion of the other gears. And so basically, if you have a multi-geared bike, there's usually another gear that will feel a lot like your favorite gear. You might have to, so if your favorite gear is sort of the middle chain ring with the middle gear in the back, you might have to go to the easy chain and a harder gear in the back, or the bigger chain ring and a easier. So sometimes you can find or sometimes you can ride in conditions. You just want to try to make sure that you're using your gears more gears as often as you can. Sometimes they're just, if you ride a very flat terrain with, no change in wind and stuff, sometimes you're just going to always want to be in the same gear, but don't be surprised when that is the one that kind of wears out. So it's, along with routinely lubricating and replacing your chain, using more gears will help keep your drivetrain from wearing out prematurely. For your body, so staying in a gear that is low enough so that you can maintain a really good pedaling cadence. And there's a pretty big range. So anywhere between, let's say, 70 to 110 RPM, depending on kind of what kind of biker you are. Most of the time will help ensure that you're not putting too much strain on your knees. So I think sometimes people, either they don't know that pedaling that fast is sort of what you should be doing. My best advice for someone is to try to make friends with someone who's a really experienced cyclist and go for a short ride with them and watch them bike. And one thing you might notice is that if it's not you showing someone else, so you could be that very experienced bicyclist, but if that's not you, you might notice that they're pedaling at a pretty fast rate and they're staying in a gear that's easy enough to allow them to do that. And that's really efficient and it's much easier on your knees than kind of that like pedaling. And then I just put in a tip on like way to get an accurate read on how fast you're pedaling. So most riders tend to think that they're pedaling faster than they are. So you could like the way that you would take your pulse, like in 10 seconds, you could just count how many rotations you're doing and times that by 6, and that is your cadence. And you can, and yeah, I write about just watching other cyclists who you're trying to model after. And then for your riding performance, so one of the goals of shifting is to help you comfortably maintain that optimal cadence under any conditions. Now, of course, if you're going up a very steep hill, you might get to the point where you're in your easiest gear and you're still struggling along, and that's the lay of the land. But you'll retain more momentum and have an easier time cycling efficiently over varied terrain if you're in the appropriate gear for that optimal cadence efficiency. And so I say a really good technique to check to see if you're in kind of your best gear is keep shifting until you'll know when it's too easy. You'll like all of a sudden you'll be doing this. So like bike along, go, well, maybe I should be in one easier gear. Let me try. And you go one easier and okay, yeah, no, that feels okay. And let me try one more, and you try one more, and then all of a sudden you're spinning out of control. So you can go to the point where you're sort of spinning a little excessively, and then you can back it off, go one gear harder. And that's kind of your optimal gear that you might want to be in for the condition that you're in. And then if you do that often enough, you won't have to be testing it as often. If you sort of get to learn to know your gears and how on you know, certain hills and stuff, this is the gear that I'm usually in. Let your legs guide you. So on here I say it's really tempting to see a big hill up ahead and then like preemptively shift into a really easy gear too soon. And if you do that, you lose a lot of momentum even before you start going up. And then it's also common to think of shifting only in response to incline or decline of the terrain. And so tire pressure, road conditions, wind, your particular energy level that day, added load, cargo that you have on the front or back of your bike will affect what gear you should be in. So you might have a gear that you're like, I always ride in this gear on this hill. And then you're like, oh yeah, I have a bag of kitty litter on my bike. So it is harder and I do need to be in an easier gear. And then in the, and so I say, really let your body guide you, let your legs and your lungs guide you. If it feels too hard, it's too hard. If it feels too easy, it's too easy. You don't have to second guess yourself about that. And then use your big rings. And this is one that's a lot easier said than done. I have a bike with 3 chain rings and I just sit in the middle ring almost all of the time. But if you have the inclination, using the small chain ring and the large chain ring, and then playing around with the gears as you go through varied terrain and under different conditions, it's better for you, it's better for your bike, and I think there's a mental inertia that we have about the big rings. There's something about like it doesn't really, you don't really ever go like, oh, I don't want to shift in the back. Like if it's too hard, you shift. If it's too easy, you shift. But for the front gears, there's kind of that like, that's a commitment. I don't really want to do that. And if you can kind of let that go, and use your shifters both in the front and the back, and you'll notice once you get in the habit of doing it, it's actually really fun. It's really exhilarating to be pedaling down a hill in a good gear. If you want to be pedaling down a hill and going really fast, or to be pedaling up a hill in the appropriate gear as well. I think that's the end of that. Oh no, it's not. All right, 1 minute. Well, you can also read on your own, but basically there's a little bit left to the handout. I just forgot that I have it on 2 pages. So anticipating the terrain. So in one sense, you don't want to shift too early when you're heading up a hill because you'll lose your momentum. On the other hand, you want to be ready to shift to help keep your momentum. And then there's little tips on shifting on hills. And then at the back, I just say, again, shift more often than you think you might be used to. And I think you'll find that it increases your experience on the bicycle. Questions about any of that before we sign off? Makes me want to go out and bike. That's what it is. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to spend this evening with us. It is really my pleasure to be able to share this information with you and get myself excited to bike.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.
So I think right before the class we were saying we're not sure what these classes will look like next year. There's hope that they might be in person again starting in the fall. But we'll,
And there are 2 more classes over the summer that Chuck will teach midday, so
great,
I'll send out notices about those.
great, super. But yeah, my series will start up again in September. That'll be the flat fix, I think. We
We haven't said it yet, but probably.
haven't said it yet, but yeah, the topics tend to repeat. If there's a topic, that's another thing you could write on the feedback form. If there's a topic that I haven't covered over the past several years that you want to see covered, we're always open to either a whole new topic or incorporating pieces of other topics into the classes to keep them useful for you.